Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. We're continuing our discussion of diplomacy between the wars. And in this final lecture, I suppose we could qualify this lecture as part of diplomacy during the war, as we're going to talk about the process that drew the United States actively into World War II, the infamous attack at Pearl Harbor. From the early 1930s, Japan had shown a growing interest in expanding its sphere of influence in the Pacific Ocean. It had drawn up plans for what's been described as a co-prosperity sphere, meaning it would dominate the Pacific Basin. It had drawn up its map of the Far East, including China, French Indochina, and the Philippines and other areas, and began setting out to conquer those areas by the mid to late 1930s. While the United States had one eye on Europe, FDR was certainly aware that Japan was working in the Far East to achieve this conquest, and he was concerned. The quarantine speech was an early example of that concern. But there really wasn't a great way of dealing with the Japanese, as the attack into Manchuria in 1931 illustrated. By 1940, Japan was making things happen in the Far East and was also on the fringes of the European conflict. In September 1940, Japan, with Italy and Germany, signed the Tripartite Agreement, which said that an attack on one was an attack against all of them. This was indirectly aimed at the United States. In September of 1940, Japan also signed an agreement with Vichy France, the German government in France, to take French Indochina. So Japan's interest in Southeast Asia was expanding rapidly. In July of 1941, the United States launched an embargo against Japan, followed by the British and the Dutch. So Japan was surrounded by what historians have come to call the ABCD: America, Britain, China, and the Dutch. Throughout much of 1941, Japan and the United States engaged in talks over such things as the embargo. We had stopped sending Japan scrap iron and steel, and threatened to stop sending airplane fuel and oil. Japan, while a very productive nation, by its nature is short on raw materials. It doesn't have a lot of land to provide these kind of things. Hence its plan during this period to take over much of China, Indochina, and the Pacific. Those places would provide many raw materials for Japan to prosper. At the same time, the United States did provide raw materials, and during this time we launched the embargo. So Japan in many ways was dependent on our help, and once we launched the embargo, they had to look elsewhere. By late 1941, they were distancing themselves from the United States and growing closer to Germany and Italy. This alliance shifted the negotiations because the United States could no longer assume that Japan was bluffing about war. As one Japanese diplomat said in July 1941, "We will not be deterred by the possibility of being involved in a war with England and America." By August, Japanese representatives came to the United States to try to negotiate with FDR. FDR demanded Japan withdraw from China and withdraw from French Indochina before he would even negotiate. This Japan clearly would not do. So at that point it seemed war was inevitable. I would note that there are some scholars who argue that FDR, in fact, encouraged the launch of the war by these sorts of actions, by enforcing the embargo, by making demands of Japan that they clearly would not meet. Some scholars have argued that FDR was forcing Japan into a corner, out of which the only solution was to fight. For the ensuing months, awkward negotiations continued as both sides prepared for, and indeed expected, the outbreak of war. So, when the attack at Pearl Harbor was launched, it wasn't a complete surprise to the Americans that Japan had launched an attack. But they were more surprised at the location of the attack. Where would Japan attack? Well, in fact, Pearl Harbor and Hawaii were at the very farthest reaches of Japanese capabilities at that time. And so the United States assumed that if an attack were launched, it would come perhaps at the Aleutian Islands, the little string of islands off of the end of Alaska, or perhaps in the area of the Philippines in the southern Pacific. And in fact, as we'll discuss later, on the same day that they launched the attack at Pearl Harbor, the Japanese did launch attacks in these other areas. But the point is that Americans were preparing for attacks elsewhere more than they were preparing for an attack at Pearl Harbor. By November, the Americans and Japanese were engaged in a final, fruitless exchange of proposals. By late November, Japan made its final offer, and by the end of November, the Americans had made their final proposal. It was on November 26th in Japan that the Japanese task force left ports bound for Pearl Harbor. Of course, the Americans didn't know that was the final destination. But both sides had made proposals that the other could not accept, and so it seemed war was almost inevitable. There are some other elements of this I want to address before we get to the attack itself. There have been some scholars who suggested that the United States knew the attack at Pearl Harbor was coming and intentionally allowed it to happen. This involves also the efforts at breaking Japanese codes. In the aftermath of Pearl Harbor, the United States, along with Great Britain, did in fact break Japanese codes and have a pretty clear understanding throughout the war of Japanese coded messages. Prior to the attack at Pearl Harbor, those code-breaking efforts were not as advanced. And while the Americans were intercepting some messages and did have some hints that something might be coming, they also were not well positioned to make use of that intelligence. And so whatever information they did glean, it was not being passed along to the officials who would have benefited from it prior to the attack at Pearl Harbor. So it does seem that very late in the day, there was some understanding that an attack might be coming. Some efforts were made to relay the information to officials at Pearl Harbor, but those efforts came far short of actively defending the port in a meaningful way. So I think it's a misreading of history to state that the United States knew the attack was coming and allowed it to happen. This would be akin to saying we knew the attacks of 9/11 were coming and allowed them to happen. In hindsight, there was some intelligence floating around, and there was some attempt to make use of the information, but nothing that could be taken so far as to say that the United States allowed it to happen. Another element of this is that the Americans didn't know the disposition of the Japanese fleet. That is, they didn't know where they were or where they were going to attack. We did have intelligence that much of the fleet had left its port in Japan, but again, with uncertainty as far as where they were going, it became a matter of finding a needle in a haystack. At that point in time, radar intelligence was in its infancy, and really the only way to spot the Japanese fleet was just that, visually, from a reconnaissance aircraft. And we weren't really looking for the Japanese fleet on its way to Pearl Harbor. Again, we were looking near the Aleutian Islands or the Philippines, which was actually far off base from where the Japanese fleet was actually going. So, while we did understand that an attack might be imminent, and again, there was some intelligence indicating this, we just weren't looking in the right place, and we weren't expecting it to come at Pearl Harbor. A final ingredient in all of this was American arrogance and racism. We simply didn't expect that the Japanese were capable and prepared and able enough to carry off an attack with this kind of devastating impact. And it's one of the features of the Pacific War that the United States for a long time consistently underestimated the abilities of the Japanese. So, of course, the final day of infamy arrived on December 7th, 1941, when Japan launched its attack at Pearl Harbor. And while, again, it's an overstatement to say we knew it was coming, In some quarters, there was actually a bit of relief that the diplomatic dance by that point was over, and now we could fully engage with this war. Henry Stimson wrote in his diary when he learned of the attack, "My first feeling was of relief that the indecision was over and that a crisis had come in a way which would unite all of our people." And so on that morning, December 7th, 1941, the Japanese launched several waves of air attacks and naval attacks against the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. These were largely derived from 6 Japanese aircraft carriers that had sailed into that area. Ultimately, about 2,400 Americans were killed, more than 1,000 others wounded. 188 U.S. aircraft were destroyed, and all of the significant American ships in the harbor were either badly damaged or sunk. Many of the land installations at the base were damaged as well. It was a devastating surprise attack. The American fleet was decimated after this attack. And yet, it was not a complete crippling blow to American war efforts. And of course, history shows that the United States was able to survive the attack, rebound, and eventually win the war itself. One of the main reasons for that is that the American aircraft carriers in the Pacific Fleet were not in the harbor that day. One of the precautionary measures that American naval leadership had taken was sending out different groups of ships each day so that not all of the American fleet would be in the harbor at any one given time. And on that day, it was the aircraft carriers who were out on maneuvers. There was actually some debate and discussion amongst Japanese leadership in the midst of the attack whether they should seek out and try to launch an attack against the American carriers that were not in the harbor. Japanese leadership ultimately decided not to do that. It would have been a risky endeavor to try to launch another attack seeking aircraft carriers that they didn't know where they were. In any case, the American carrier fleet survived the attack, and for several months after Pearl Harbor, represented really the only surviving aspect of the American Navy in the Pacific. It would ultimately be those carriers who would prove to be the decisive force in the Pacific in the aftermath. We will get to some of those conflicts a little bit further in our lectures. In the immediate sense, it was the attack at Pearl Harbor that drew the United States into the war. Japan immediately declared war against the United States, actually after the attack had been launched. And the next day, President FDR made the war declaration from the United States perspective, including the famous phrase, "a date which will live in infamy." And so when all was said and done, it was not the diplomacy in the Atlantic and all of the different episodes occurring in Europe that drew the United States into the war, but rather this surprise attack in the Pacific that got the Americans fully involved. In the longer term, many scholars look back at the attack at Pearl Harbor, while it was a successful surprise attack in the short term, as the ultimate defeat in the war against Japan. Admiral Hara Tadachi summed up the Japanese attack by saying, "We won a great tactical victory at Pearl Harbor, and thereby lost the war."